From the beginning of time, society has carried with it certain expectations. Expectations about how one should live, how one should behave, and more importantly, how one should arrange their personal life. One of the most enduring of these expectations has been marriage. The idea that life must naturally progress toward partnership, family, and responsibility has become so deeply ingrained in culture that questioning it often feels like questioning the very structure of society itself. Friedrich Nietzsche, however, was never one to accept such structures without interrogation. He saw through many of the illusions that people cling to for comfort. And when it comes to marriage, Nietzsche had much to say, not only about the institution itself, but also about why society values it so highly and what that reveals about the nature of power, control, and freedom. It is important to pause here and consider the nature of Nietzsche's critique. He was not writing in a world like ours, filled with dating apps, relationship advice influencers, and endless content about love and companionship. He was writing in the 19th century, a time when marriage was practically unquestioned, a pillar of both morality and stability. Yet his words echo forward into our modern age because the forces that drive society to demand marriage have not disappeared, they have simply changed their form. When Nietzsche wrote that marriage is the will of two to create the one who is more than those who created it, he was pointing to the ideal of marriage as something beyond two people, something society itself uses to reproduce its values. And so, we ask, why does society want people married, not free? Why does the collective feel threatened by those who choose another path, whether that is a single life, a life of solitude, or a life devoted to pursuits beyond family? Nietzsche's philosophy helps illuminate the subtle ways in which social order enforces conformity, and how freedom often exists in opposition to what society demands. The first thing to note is how deeply marriage is tied to control. To Nietzsche, society thrives not on free individuals, but on predictable ones. A person who marries, who raises children, who takes on obligations, becomes tied into the machinery of stability. They are less likely to stray too far from the norms, less likely to resist, less likely to question. As Nietzsche might say, society tames the wolf into a dog, and man is the most domesticated animal of all. What is marriage, then, if not one of the most powerful forms of taming? When a person is married, their life naturally becomes organized around certain duties. The duty to a partner, the duty to family, the duty to provide. These duties serve not only the individuals involved, but also the larger social structure. For governments, for economies, for traditions, marriage is the great stabilizer. It produces citizens who are invested in maintaining order because their own survival depends on it. A single person, however, is harder to predict. Their loyalties are not bound in the same way. They may drift, explore, resist, or even rebel. For society, such a person carries a dangerous kind of freedom. Nietzsche was aware of this danger. He warned that the pressure to conform, to marry, to fit into the expected mold was not simply about individual happiness, but about the needs of the collective. In individuals, insanity is rare. But in groups, parties, nations, and epochs, it is the rule. Marriage, in this sense, becomes a way to enforce the group's sanity. By encouraging and often demanding that people marry, society ensures that individuals remain tied into its rhythm, repeating its traditions, passing down its values, and strengthening its control. But let us look deeper. Beyond control, there is also the question of illusion. Nietzsche often wrote about how human beings cling to illusions to make life bearable. Marriage, for many, functions as such an illusion. It offers the promise of meaning, companionship, and permanence in a world where nothing is guaranteed. Society amplifies this illusion, portraying marriage as not only desirable but necessary. The one who resists is made to feel incomplete. as if freedom itself were a deficiency. Consider how the narratives of culture are built. From childhood, stories, films, songs, and traditions all reinforce the idea that life without marriage is somehow lesser. Society rarely celebrates the free individual who walks alone. Instead, it celebrates union, togetherness, family. This constant reinforcement is not accidental. It is a way of shaping desire, of steering people toward paths that benefit the social order. Nietzsche's insight into morality applies here. The individual has always had to struggle to keep from being overwhelmed by the tribe. The tribe, in this case, overwhelms by convincing us that marriage is not only natural but unavoidable. Freedom, however, is always costly. A free individual bears the weight of their own existence without the shield of illusions. They take responsibility for their choices, their solitude, their path. For Nietzsche, this was both the great challenge and the great opportunity. To choose freedom over conformity is to embrace the uncertainty of life, to live without the safety net that society provides. It is to live, in Nietzsche's terms, as an overcomer, one who creates their own values rather than adopting the values handed down by tradition. Marriage, then, becomes not only a personal decision but a philosophical one. When someone marries because society tells them to, they surrender a portion of their freedom. They adopt values not because they chose them, but because they were given. And here is the crux of Nietzsche's thought. Such adoption is the hallmark of the herd. The herd lives by rules, by customs, by the comfort of belonging. The free spirit, however, lives differently. The surest way to corrupt a youth, Nietzsche wrote, is to instruct him to hold in higher esteem those who think alike than those who think differently. Marriage in society's hands becomes precisely this instruction, a demand to think alike, to live alike, to move in unison with the herd. But what happens to those who resist? Society often labels them as selfish, immature, or incomplete. They are painted as people who have failed to fulfill their duty. This labeling is powerful, for it pushes people back toward conformity. Nietzsche, however, admired those who could resist such pressure. He saw in them the potential for greatness, for the creation of new ways of being. For him, freedom was not just a rejection of the herd, but the starting point of higher life. To expand further, let us reflect on the economic dimensions of marriage. In Nietzsche's time, marriage was often tied to property, inheritance, and family honor. Today, the form has changed, but the principle remains. Married individuals are more likely to invest in homes, to participate in markets, to contribute to consumer stability. Entire industries are built on the assumption of marriage. Weddings, housing, insurance, childcare, family entertainment. The single life, by contrast, resists easy categorization. It is not as predictable, not as easily targeted, not as efficient for economic stability. From society's perspective, the free individual is not only unpredictable but also unprofitable. Nietzsche's criticism of modern morality fits neatly into this economic critique. Morality is the herd instinct in the individual, he declared. Marriage, as a moral expectation, is precisely this instinct made concrete. It is not about the flourishing of the individual but the continuation of the herd. The one who resists, the one who refuses, threatens to expose the arbitrary nature of these moral rules. By their very existence, they reveal that another way of life is possible, a way that does not depend on the illusions society has carefully constructed. And yet, Nietzsche also acknowledged the complexity of marriage. He did not see it purely as oppression, nor purely as liberation. He saw in it the possibility of greatness, but only if entered into with awareness. He wrote, "It is not a lack of love, but a lack of friendship that makes unhappy marriages." This was not simply a critique of failed relationships, but of the way society approaches marriage altogether. When marriage is pursued as a duty, as an obligation, it becomes shallow, fragile. But when it is pursued from genuine friendship, from mutual respect, from shared creation, it can transcend the herd and become something higher. The tragedy, of course, is that society rarely encourages this higher form. Instead, it promotes the shallow version, the version that sustains its own order. The free individual, therefore, must be cautious. To choose marriage blindly is to risk becoming a cog in the machinery. To choose it with awareness, however, may allow for the possibility of something greater. Nietzsche's warning is clear. He who cannot command himself should obey, and he who can command himself may command others. Marriage, then, is not inherently the enemy of freedom, but it becomes so when chosen without command of oneself. And so, we circle back to the original question: why does society want you married, not free? Because marriage stabilizes, it controls, it reproduces values, it sustains the economy, and it maintains the herd. Freedom, by contrast, destabilizes. It threatens. It reveals alternatives. Nietzsche's philosophy helps us see through the illusion, to recognize that much of what is presented as natural is, in fact, constructed. And once we see the construction, we are faced with a choice. Do we conform, or do we resist? Nietzsche's challenge to us is not to reject marriage outright, but to question it, to examine the reasons we are drawn to it, to ask whether our choices are truly ours or whether they belong to the herd. For in the end, the greatest task, as Nietzsche would say, is to become who we are. And that becoming cannot happen in chains. Whether those chains are visible or invisible, whether they are imposed by force or by the quiet, persistent expectations of society. If we look at history, society has always rewarded those who fit into the expected mold. Marriage has been presented as not just a personal choice, but as a duty, almost like proof that one belongs. For centuries, a man was not seen as truly complete unless he had a wife, children, and a household under his name. A woman, in the same way, was judged by her ability to marry and to raise a family. And although today's world looks very different on the surface, the undertone remains. The same pressures exist, only wrapped in new forms. The language may have changed, but the message stays the same. Marriage equals maturity. Marriage equals respectability. Marriage equals being taken seriously. Nietzsche often warned about this kind of invisible control. He argued that society does not simply want people to live, it wants them to live in a way that benefits the group, even if it means sacrificing their individuality. He once said, "The individual has always had to struggle to keep from being overwhelmed by the tribe." That struggle is still alive today. For many, marriage is not simply a celebration of love. It becomes a test of whether one has submitted to the collective order. Think about how people often react when someone reaches their 30s or 40s without being married. There is usually surprise, followed by questions, sometimes even pity. The person is rarely left alone in peace. Instead, they are reminded sometimes subtly, sometimes openly, that they are not doing what they are supposed to do. Why is this the case? Why is marriage so deeply tied to the idea of being normal? It is because society fears what it cannot regulate. A married person is easier to place. Their responsibilities, their routines, their priorities are predictable. But a single person, especially one who is content and self-sufficient, is harder to categorize. They do not fit neatly into the structure that society has built. Nietzsche believed that freedom often makes others uncomfortable. A free individual, someone who decides not to live by the same rules, exposes the fragility of those rules. By choosing a different path, they reveal that the rules were never absolute to begin with, they were choices all along. And this is dangerous to society, because if too many people begin to question, too many begin to resist, the structure itself weakens. Consider how many industries are built around the expectation of marriage. Weddings themselves are billion-dollar businesses. Rings, venues, photographers, clothing, all of it relies on people believing that marriage is not only important, but necessary. And beyond the wedding day, there is the life that follows. Houses designed for families, products designed for couples, even advertisements that play on the idea that one must buy this or that in order to be a good spouse or parent. Society is tied to marriage economically as much as it is culturally. When someone chooses to remain free, they are stepping outside of this cycle. They are, in a way, refusing to play the role assigned to them. But Nietzsche's warning was not just about society's influence. It was also about the individual's inner voice. He observed that many people adopt the values of society without even realizing it. They convince themselves that marriage is their personal dream, when in truth it was planted in them from childhood. Stories, movies, cultural rituals, all of these shape the imagination long before one is old enough to question. So when a person says, "I want to get married," it is worth asking, is this truly your voice? Or is it the echo of society's voice within you? Nietzsche would remind us that to be free, one must learn to separate one's own will from the will of the herd. Of course, none of this means that marriage is wrong, or that those who marry have failed in some way. The point is not to judge the act itself, but to understand the pressure behind it. If marriage is chosen freely, without fear, without obligation, then it can be a genuine path of life. But when marriage is demanded, when it is treated as the only valid option, then it becomes a tool of control. Nietzsche wanted individuals to rise above that, to see clearly, and to decide without the weight of invisible hands pushing them forward. Now think of how freedom is often framed in today's culture. We hear phrases like "settle down" as if life before marriage is chaotic or incomplete. We hear "start a family" as if family does not exist without children or legal papers. And we hear "grow up" as if adulthood is only validated by a ring. All of these phrases are subtle, but they shape how people think. Nietzsche would have asked, why must growth be measured this way? Why can't one grow by mastering their own craft, by traveling, by seeking knowledge, by living according to their nature? Why is growth tied so tightly to marriage and not to freedom? The truth is, society often views free individuals as a threat. A man who is single, successful, and content does not need to prove anything to others. A woman who is independent, fulfilled, and confident shows that her worth is not tied to a husband. These individuals break the narrative. They reveal that happiness and meaning can be built outside of the traditional path. And in doing so, they unintentionally challenge those who followed the path without questioning. This is why people often react with discomfort. It is not that they hate the free person. It is that the free person makes them question their own choices. Nietzsche called this confrontation with freedom unsettling. He believed that when people see someone living outside the herd, they feel both envy and fear. Envy, because deep down they recognize the courage it takes to live freely. Fear, because if the free person is truly happy, then what does that say about their own life? Have they lived by choice or simply by expectation? That is a heavy question, and many prefer not to face it. Instead, they defend their choices by insisting that everyone must do the same. And so, the cycle of pressure continues. But freedom, as Nietzsche saw it, is not about rejecting everything. It is about choosing consciously. It is about knowing why one does what one does. If one marries, let it be because of a genuine desire, not because of silent coercion. If one remains free, let it be because that path holds meaning, not because of fear or avoidance. The point is not to glorify one side over the other, but to strip away the illusions that cloud our judgment. And so, when we hear that society wants you married, not free, what we are really hearing is that society wants predictability, order, and continuity. It wants individuals to fit into roles that maintain the larger structure. Nietzsche understood this well, but he also understood that the highest individuals, the ones who truly rise, are those who can walk apart from the herd, even if it means walking alone. He wrote, "Become who you are." And in that short phrase lies the heart of his message. Whether one chooses marriage or freedom, the choice must come from within. As we step back, we can see the pattern more clearly. Marriage is not just a private decision, it has become a social symbol. To resist it, to remain free, is often seen as rebellion, even when it is simply an expression of individuality. Nietzsche invites us to see beyond this, to question, to reflect. He invites us to ask not, "What does society expect of me?" but "What do I expect of myself?" And that question, though simple, is powerful enough to change a life.